Welcome to Epic Church History as we continue to explore how Christianity grew in the first few centuries of the church. Today we're going to answer the question, what was city life like? What's that have to do with Christianity? The answer to the question, what was city life like, is it was abundant chaos, disorder, disease, misery, fear, and social dislocation. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? So in short, what we're going to discover today is that dense populations led to crowded housing and streets, which led to limited water and sewer options, which led to filth, which led to stink and disease, which led to death and population decline, which led to in-migration and lack of attachments, and that led to rampant crime, chaos. There were, on top of that, natural disasters. There were riots, uprisings everywhere. It was crazy. So let's dig in a little bit. And for an example city, we're going to look at the city of Antioch. It's north of Israel, in the northern part of where we would call Syria, at the bottom of where Asia Minor would run up against in modern-day Turkey. The very southern part of modern-day Turkey is where Antioch was. A very important city in the Roman Empire, strategically. We'll get into that in a minute.
When Antioch was founded, it was founded as a fortress city. Within its walls, it only had less than 1 square mile. It was founded about 300 BC.
Now, it eventually grew a little bit. These fortress cities with these walls were expensive and difficult to expand as the population grew and people wanted to live within the city walls. There was only so much space. You can't just expand the city walls every few years to accommodate. So what would happen is these cities would become very densely populated. Now in Antioch, you see there was a calculated 117 people per acre. That's including all the public land that was in Antioch that could have taken up between 25 and 40% of the land. Now, to compare, Chicago, as of like 2010, had 15 people per acre population density. So that's a major city in America with a lot less density. New York City, to compare, is 42 people per acre, and Manhattan itself is 108 people per acre. So that's a closer population density to Antioch, but keep in mind, in Manhattan, you can build up vertically. So you don't really get an idea of what everyday life was like just by looking at Manhattan. In Antioch, rarely were buildings going to be over 5 stories. In Rome, it was illegal to build a building higher than 65 feet. So you didn't get that same kind of advantage of being able to build up. It was a very densely populated place. Now, I mentioned before that there was public property that took up space in Antioch. If you account for that public space, then the population density is really more something like 195 people per acre, which is more comparable to like Manila in the Philippines. That's the most crowded city currently in the world is Manila, 168 people per acre. And again, here's a picture of Manila in the Philippines. Lots of building up. So we still I can't even grasp what life would be like living in that dense of a population. So when you have populations that are this densely populated, this crowded, the houses, of course, are going to be small, or they are going to be crowded themselves, or both. They're also built very closely to each other. not only do you have plenty of people living in these homes, but what they would do is if they were multiple stories high, a lot of times in these apartments, they would rent out the top floor to the poor, and the poor would subdivide these floors to fit as many people as possible. Now, if these buildings weren't built quite up to snuff, they would collapse, and collapsing did happen frequently in these cities. There was also a lot of opportunities for fire, as we can find out by learning about history. Fires were common, so there were all kinds of problems just within the household in these cities. Now, these streets were very narrow typically, sometimes only a matter of about 9 feet across. Sometimes it was just enough room for people to walk side by side down these streets. Even the major highways, are at most 20 to 25 feet across. So these streets were very crowded. The houses were very close to each other. Even when there was a street separating them, we read that you could stick your head out the window and have a conversation with your neighbor that was across the street. And what they would have also that we need to consider to get a good picture of what life was like here, we read about the Roman public baths, right? And next to the public baths were the public latrines. Not everybody took advantage of these, nor would everybody find themselves welcome necessarily in these public baths and public restrooms with the fancy modern aqueducts and plumbing going through the city to it. When they look at the architecture, there's no way that these baths and latrines could have supported the whole population. Not to mention, socially speaking, a lot of people would not be welcome to sit alongside senators and the upper classes in the baths. Not to mention going all the way down the street to the local public bathroom in the middle of the night when you need to relieve yourself or whatever. They weren't doing that. So what people had, well, they had to carry water back, of course, in pitchers and jars, but also they had these chamber pots. Those were very common. Sometimes they would have ravines and pits that they could go to the restroom in, but they would commonly have chamber pots in their houses. And what they would do, unfortunately, more times than maybe they should have, they wouldn't go all the way to dispose of them in the place that they probably should have disposed of them, but they would often just dump it out the window, more than once having the contents of the chamber pot landing on a unfortunate passerby. So what we had here was not only crowded cities with fires, with collapsing buildings, very close quarters, but we had filth in the streets. Garbage was thrown out in the streets. Even really wretched things thrown out in the streets. It was filthy. And what did this lead to, of course? It led to lots of bugs. It led to lots of germs and diseases and worms. They've done some digging up and found evidence that there were pinworms and whipworms and things like that were common. But also there was a lot of death. Half of the children died at birth or in infancy. Most kids would lose at least one parent before reaching adulthood. And it was just not a very great place to live if you wanted to live a long time, or even a quality of life while you were living. Many of the people would not expect, well, let me put it this way. The average life expectancy was less than 30 years old. So that really tells you what things were like. Now, the case for Antioch, as with many other Greco-Roman cities, is that as the mortality rate outpaced the population growth, outsiders would migrate in to take their place. Why? Why would you move into a city that was so miserable and crowded, especially if you were living out in the country? Well, a lot of people were looking for opportunity, but the empire would also incentivize moving into these cities. They would move in veterans, they would give property to veterans sometimes. Antioch had a very important geographic location. Strategically, it was an important city to maintain in defending the border with Persia. It was on the Orontes River. It was on major trade and travel routes, multiple major roads. It was near the Mediterranean. Antioch was this fortress city, like I mentioned, that controlled the river. And parts of it, when I look at the map and some of the imagery that we have, it reminds me of Pittsburgh. It had 7 bridges over the river. All of the public buildings, a lot of the important public buildings were arranged on this island, surrounded by the 2 channels of the river there. Now, the Romans understood that it would be dangerous to leave the city unoccupied or underoccupied, so they were quick to settle veterans there. But there were always people looking for new opportunities and new places, even beyond the incentives that the government might put. There were people that were looking for a new place to be. And just as a side note, these cities required so much in-migration to account for the mortality rates that the rural population began to decline. And eventually, as the cities had less people from the outside to bring in, large portions of Rome were also becoming weaker. The cities were becoming weaker, and large portions of Rome were becoming weaker with less people to bring in. Now, so there was in-migration into these cities. What happens when you're constantly losing people and bringing new people from the outside in? You have this constant turnover, and you have a lack of social attachments. And with the lack of social attachments, the lack of people that really know each other, you have a lack of an established social, ethical, moral order. And what happens when you have this lack of attachments and this lack of social, ethical, moral order, understood, agreed upon way of life and ethics, what happens is you have higher crime rates, which this is reflected in modern cities. There's a correlation with how well you know your neighbors and how safe your neighborhood is. The less you know your neighbors, the more crime there's bound to be, even today. So just how chaotic was Antioch? Well, let's consider all of these ongoing realities that we've mentioned, with so many different cultures and backgrounds coming into such tight proximity. There were numerous occasions for riots and discord. There were frequent riots, 6 of which we would call major periods of rioting, resulting in substantial death and destruction. Many of these riots resulted in fires themselves, but there were frequent fires, as we mentioned, with the houses being so close, being mostly built out of wood. The fires could get really serious really quickly. There were 4 major fires that burned the city completely or almost completely. And of those 4 major fires, 3 were accidental and 1 was very much on purpose. Now, they were also conquered by unfriendly forces 11 times over this 600-year period. I should have mentioned this 600-year period is about from 300 BC to about 300 AD. And over this time, they were conquered 11 times, plundered and sacked 5 times, and then they were also sieged but did not fall twice. They experienced at least 5 serious famines over this period, 3 epidemics with a mortality rate where over 25% of the population died each time. And then in Antioch, earthquakes were very common. 8 to 10 times the earthquakes were so bad that they destroyed everything and lots of people died. So if you were to add up just the major catastrophic events here that happened over a 600-year period, you've got significant devastation averaging once every 15 years. So imagine living in a place where you're just like, well, it's been about 15 years. We're due for, let's see, an earthquake or an epidemic or a fire that completely destroys the whole city. What is it going to be this time? I know it didn't happen exactly like that. Sometimes multiple things would happen all at once, possibly. But what a great place to live, right? But this is exactly the place that would become known as the cradle of Christianity. In Acts chapter 11, you read that this was the place where Christians were first called Christians. It was set up perfectly for Christianity for a number of reasons. There was a high Jewish presence there. Go back and watch one of our other episodes if you'd like to learn more about what difference that made. But when the Christians arrived on the scene in Antioch and several other chaotic Greco-Roman cities, they were introducing new norms and new meaning, new kinds of social relationships. They not only brought new meaning to life, but they also helped bring about a whole new quality of life to the communities in which they became planted. Here's a quote from Rodney Stark in the book that we're using as a basis for all of this. He says, Christianity revitalized life in Greco-Roman cities by providing new norms and new kinds of social relationships able to cope with many urgent urban problems. To cities filled with the homeless and impoverished, Christianity offered charity as well as hope. To cities filled with newcomers and strangers, Christianity offered an immediate basis for attachments. To cities filled with orphans and widows, Christianity provided a new and expanded sense of family. To cities torn by violent ethnic strife, Christianity offered a new basis for social solidarity. And to cities faced with epidemics, fires, and earthquakes, Christianity offered effective nursing services. Well, that about wraps up that discussion. Next week, I plan to talk to you about the martyrs and why. Well, let's ask the question. Would people being martyred and knowing that they could very well die for their faith, would that cause people to be attracted to that faith? Or would it make people want to run the other way and say, no way, I'm not going to join that faith. People could get killed for doing that. Well, let's explore that question next week. Thanks for joining us.